Tell me which city you're listening from, and let it stand as proof that these old names still have living witnesses. If you want the chronicle to continue, steady, faithful, and unhurried, subscribe and keep the candle burning a little longer. Before human kingdoms measured history in reigns and borders, the Telquesir were already ancient in Faerun, ancient in the way a forest is ancient, not because it never changes, but because it changes slowly and remembers everything. Their earliest centuries were not a march of banners. They were migration, settlement, and the patient work of learning how a land answers you when you speak to it in the wrong tongue. Then, almost without announcing itself, that wandering hardened into civilization. Later, Elven scholars and human chroniclers would reach for the same phrase when trying to name the beginning of true Elven imperial power, the first flowering. It sounds gentle. It sounds like art. But a flowering is also competition. Roots tightening beneath the soil, branches widening until one canopy begins to steal the light of another. The point of the name is not that the age was innocent. The point is that it was beautiful enough to hide its danger. In that distant span, the people gathered into great realms whose names still fall like carved stone in the mouth. Arivandar, Ilifarn, Mayeritar, Chantel Othrair, and Keltormir. Around them formed lesser kingdoms and forest holds, some lasting, some vanishing into records and lament. While in the south, the dark elves of Elithir held their own proud dominion long before their fate became a single, dreaded lesson repeated by later ages. This is the first truth outsiders rarely grasp. Elven empires did not suddenly appear. They condensed. They accumulated. They built themselves the way a coastline builds itself, grain by grain, tide by tide, until the shape of power became undeniable. Each realm condensed around a different promise. Ilifarn, along the western reaches of Faerun, learned early the discipline of frontiers, how to hold beauty against pressure, how to bargain with neighbors who did not share elven time, and how to keep a kingdom from becoming a museum. It is remembered not as the loudest realm, but as one that understood that borders are living things. Neglect them, and they bleed. Keltormir belonged to the deep southern forests, a realm whose strength was less about walls and more about continuity, about shaping a kingdom that could survive by remaining alive. Where other powers were tempted to prove themselves in stone and conquest, Keltormir's identity was tied to the patient authority of the green world itself. Chantel Othrair rose where its position forced it to become politically literate. It sat close enough to great neighbors to feel every shift in their mood, and it learned to treat alliances not as sentimental bonds, but as structures that must be maintained. In that kind of place, you learn to hear the meaning behind polite words. You learn to sense when courtesy is only a sheath for a blade. And then there was Mayeritar, remembered for its artistry and its distinctive spiritual character, a realm that stands out in the sources because it represents something the later crown wars would nearly extinguish. The notion that elven greatness could be expressed as culture and harmony rather than dominance. Even in memory, it carries the atmosphere of an argument against imperial certainty. But over all of these, like a sun that begins to demand worship, rose Arivandar. Arivandar became the great northern power most closely associated with the Gold Elves, and its self-image was never modest. The courts of Arivandar treated refinement as a form of legitimacy. Their high mages and nobles did not merely claim excellence, they treated it as a proof of right. In their own telling, they were not conquerors in waiting. They were custodians of the people's destiny. That belief can sustain a realm for a long time. It can also poison it. Because once a court convinces itself it is the purest expression of civilization, it begins to look at every neighboring difference as a flaw, something that should be corrected, improved, guided, absorbed. Imperialism does not always begin with armies. Sometimes it begins with etiquette. Sometimes it begins with the quiet assumption that your ways are not merely yours, but the proper shape of the future. A subtle shift happens in this era that changes everything. High magic stops being only wonder and becomes permanence. When elven realms wove wards into their cities, when they shaped landscapes with spells meant to endure beyond a mortal dynasty, they made a statement that was as political as it was mystical. This will last. Not for decades, not for centuries, for ages. That is a beautiful promise. It is also a provocation. Permanence draws attention. It draws admiration that curdles into envy. It draws fear. It draws the temptation to believe that if you can make something endure, you should also be the one to decide what deserves to endure and what must be removed. Here, the first flowering begins to darken. Diplomacy becomes leverage. Leverage becomes expectation. Expectation becomes obligation. And obligation, so often described in noble language, becomes the beginning of rule. At first, Arivandar's influence spreads as culture. Standards, hierarchies, judgments delivered with calm confidence. Then it spreads as policy. Alliances that feel less like partnerships and more like chains made of silk. Then it spreads as destiny. The idea that a unified elven world would be safer, stronger, cleaner, so long as the unity is built under the right crown. Around this same time, the map of elven realms becomes crowded with names that later ages would struggle to place. Lesser kingdoms rise and fall. Some are swallowed into larger neighbors. Some fracture under internal rivalry. Some simply fade as their people move, leaving behind ruins that later civilizations misname and misunderstand. The pattern is clear even when the details blur. The people are already learning that longevity does not guarantee stability. Time does not protect you from what you are becoming. It only amplifies it. And in the south, Elithir stands as a warning that history is rarely clean. The Dark Elves were not a footnote at the edge of elven civilization. They were part of the elven world's power, politics, and pride. Their later descent into horror does not erase the fact that they were once a realm with its own identity, its own ambitions, its own claims to legitimacy. That is why the later catastrophe matters. It was not an alien corruption. It was an internal unraveling. So the first flowering ends the way many golden ages end, not with a single collapse, but with a hardening. Borders become sacred. Courts become suspicious. Pride becomes doctrine. The language of unity becomes more common precisely because unity is slipping out of reach. In the luminous halls of Arivandar, the idea forms that will haunt every chapter that follows. That one realm might be fit to speak for all elves, because it believes itself the most enlightened. It is an elegant thought, a clean thought. And it is the kind of thought that turns a rise into a tragedy without ever needing to announce, at the start, that tragedy is what it intends. High magic was never just power in the way younger peoples imagine it. In the first flowering, it was closer to a covenant between mages and monarchs, between a realm and the land it claimed to love, between living elves and the long, unseen patience of the weave. That is why the early elven empires felt unlike later human kingdoms. Their walls were not always stone. Their borders were not always marked. Their strongest defenses were often invisible, woven into the air, pressed into the rhythm of rivers. braided through groves so old they seemed to breathe with a single shared lung. A visitor could walk beneath a canopy in Keltormir and not see a single fortress, and still feel watched. Not by soldiers, by the forest itself, alive in a way that made trespass feel like sacrilege rather than crime. In Ilifarn's domains, the coast and riverlands carried the same sensation, that the land had been taught to remember who belonged and who did not. This was the first quiet revelation of Elven statecraft. Many of their cities were less like settlements and more like ongoing spells, maintained not by a single archmage's will, but by generations of discipline. And discipline mattered, because high magic demanded a price that most courts preferred not to speak aloud. Spells of that magnitude were not cast in a moment. They were prepared across seasons. They required circles of practitioners who trusted one another with their lives, and rulers who could accept that some works of protection might outlast the very line that commissioned them. More than once, a realm's safety depended on mages who would never see the full fruit of what they began. The empires loved to celebrate the results. Glimmering wards, sanctuaries that turned invaders away, roads that bent through the world like a secret held in the open. They spoke less often of the patience and peril underneath. From this grew a strange paradox. The more a realm relied on high magic, the more it had to become conservative about who could touch it. High mages were revered, but also watched. Apprenticeship became political. Bloodlines became credentials. The courts learned to fear not only hostile neighbors, but internal experiments, because a single reckless working could scar a forest, sour a coastline, or twist a sacred place into something that would not heal for centuries. This is where the empires began to diverge in temperament. Some realms treated high magic as stewardship, an obligation to preserve. Others treated it as proof of superiority. And nowhere was the second attitude more carefully nurtured than in Arivandar. In Arivandar's bright courts, refinement hardened into doctrine. Their rulers, coronals in the old tradition, did not simply govern, they embodied an ideal. They curated culture the way a jeweler cuts a gem, removing what they considered impurities, polishing what pleased the eye, declaring the finished thing perfect. In time, that aesthetic judgment slid into moral judgment. If Arivandar's art was finer, its customs cleaner, its magic more enduring, then surely its authority was more legitimate. That logic sounds cold when spoken plainly. In a palace, it sounds like destiny. The subtler truth is that Arivandar did not begin by threatening other elven realms. It began by defining them. It treated Mieritar's blended identity, its mixture of peoples, its different spiritual emphasis, its refusal to measure worth by a single court's standards, as charming at best, suspicious at worst. It looked at Chantel Othryer's balancing diplomacy and saw weakness disguised as prudence. It looked at Ilifarn's careful restraint and mistook it for hesitation. And it looked at Keltormir's deep-rooted woodland sovereignty and told itself that such a realm must inevitably need guidance, because it did not seek the same kind of visible glory. Even Elithir, powerful in the south, became an object of fixation in the north, not merely because it was strong, but because it was different in a way Arivandar could not control. The existence of another great elven power outside its orbit was an insult to its unspoken hierarchy. That is another quiet revelation of empire. Sometimes it does not hate you for what you do. Sometimes it hates you for continuing to exist beyond its reach. Trade and travel should have softened these tensions, and for a time they did. Elven realms exchanged crafted wonders lore, and emissaries who spoke the old courtesies like music. But the longer the empires endured, the more those exchanges became instruments. A gift became a ledger entry. A marriage became a treaty. A treaty became a lover. And because elves live so long, leverage could be applied slowly, so slowly that it felt like the natural order of things. A border dispute could simmer for a century and still be considered recent. A slight delivered in one coronal's hall could outlive the coronal who delivered it and become a grudge inherited by heirs who had never met the original offender. In younger civilizations, time burns away offense. Among the Telquesir, time can preserve it like amber. In the middle of this age, a turning point formed, not a battle, not a single decree, but a shift in how the elven world understood legitimacy. Arivandar's ruling houses, most notably the Vishan line, began to speak as if unity was not a choice but an obligation. Not simply alliance, not mutual defense. Unity under one guiding crown. Their rhetoric cast itself as protection of elven purity and destiny, and it carried a seductive implication. That those who resisted were not merely political rivals, but obstacles to the people's future. This was the mid-part anchor that redefined everything that came before. Settlement had become empire. Empire had become ideology. Once a realm convinces itself that it represents the true expression of its people, every compromise begins to look like betrayal. Every neighbor's independence becomes a problem to be solved. And every act of coercion can be dressed as a reluctant kindness. Other empires did not ignore this. They adapted. Ilefarn strengthened its vigilance and relied even more on subtle defenses rather than open shows of force. Chantel Othrair leaned harder into balance, trying to prevent any single realm from swallowing the rest. Miyeritar's position grew more precarious, because it was neither distant enough to be ignored, nor aligned enough to be trusted by Arivandar's hardening doctrine. Keltormir, deep in the south, watched the northern shift with the quiet dread of a forest that hears distant thunder and knows the storm will eventually arrive. And beneath all of it ran the reality that high magic, for all its beauty, had made the empires more fragile in one critical way. When your civilization is bound into great workings, into wards, sanctuaries, enchantments meant to last, your pride becomes structural. Your arrogance becomes architecture. The more permanent your achievements, the more unbearable it feels to admit you could be wrong. A human king can tear down his predecessor's monument and claim a new era. An elven coronal who inherits a realm shaped by ancient spells inherits not just power, but the weight of decisions made thousands of years earlier. So the First Flowering's bright legacy became its trap. By the close of this chapter, the elven empires stood at the height of their mastery, cities and forests shaped by art that seemed eternal, courts polished to a ruthless elegance, magic refined into an instrument of identity. And yet the world beneath them had changed. The question was no longer whether the people could build wonders that endured. The question was whether they could endure the kind of certainty those wonders inspired, because in that certainty, the seed of the Crown Wars was already alive, not as a prophecy, but as a habit of mind. Elven longevity did not make them automatically wise. It made their mistakes last longer. A realm does not become an empire the moment it wins a battle. It becomes an empire the moment it decides that the world around it is incomplete without its rule. For the elven kingdoms of the First Flowering, that moment arrived quietly, disguised as principle. Arivandar's courts did not announce conquest as greed. They framed it as responsibility. They spoke of the people's proper destiny, of a unified elven world, guided by the most refined tradition, protected by the most disciplined magic, elevated by the most enlightened crown. The language was careful. It always is at the start. Tyranny rarely introduces itself as hunger. It arrives wearing the mask of order. And order, among the Telquesir, carried a special weight, because they had seen what chaos could do over centuries. The earliest pressure Arivandar applied was not military. It was social. Envoys arrived with praise that felt like evaluation. Invitations carried expectations. Courtly standards spread outward like a perfume that was also a warning. Those who did not adopt the higher ways would be treated as provincial. Subtle slights became tools. Compliments became comparisons. In a world that lives long enough to remember every nuance, such tactics could shape politics without a single blade being drawn. But influence is never satisfied for long, not when it believes itself righteous. Chantel Othrayer, positioned between larger powers, became one of the first tests of Arivandar's evolving ideology. Its strength had always been balance, knowing which alliances to hold loosely and which to tighten, knowing when to speak and when silence preserves more than words. To Arivandar, that balance began to look like refusal, and refusal, under an imperial mindset, is not a neutral act. It becomes defiance. Here the sources become colder, more formal, as if the record itself is trying to avoid responsibility. A dispute over status, a conflict over authority. The question of whether Chantel Othrayer owed deference, whether it had strayed from proper Elven tradition. Some accounts emphasize insult and protocol. Others emphasize resources and strategic ground. The details vary, but the shape remains. Arivandar's ruling houses, most notoriously the Vaishyan line, pushed to turn influence into ownership. This was the first major revelation of the rising empires. What began as a cultural hierarchy had become a political weapon. And once a weapon exists, someone will insist on using it. So the pressure sharpened. Alliances were redefined. Old pacts were reinterpreted. The polite language of unity turned into the colder language of obligation. In time, the dispute ceased to be about diplomacy at all. It became about who had the right to decide what Elven civilization was supposed to be. That question is the seed of the Crown Wars. Not one war, many. A long unraveling where each crown claimed it was defending the people while tearing the people apart. The tragedy is that no one needed to invent hatred. They only needed to stop restraining it. Arivandar's northern power, growing heavier, began to tilt the entire Elven world out of balance. Neighboring realms found themselves forced into decisions they did not want. If they opposed Arivandar openly, they risked conflict with the strongest northern state. If they aligned too closely, they risked becoming a shadow of it. Neutrality, once possible under the wide, patient sky of the first flowering, became harder to sustain. Illafarn understood this with an old coastal caution. It had endured by recognizing that some threats are not storms you can fight. They are tides you must plan around. Miyeritar understood it with a different kind of dread, because Miyeritar's very nature challenged Arivandar's claim to be the rightful model of Elven greatness. A realm that expressed splendor without imperial appetite was, in its mere existence, an accusation. The more Arivandar elevated the idea of purity, the more it needed a counterexample to condemn. And in the south, Elithir watched all of this with a wary intelligence that later ages would not credit it. The Dark Elves were not ignorant observers. They were participants in the same continental game of pride and consequence. Their realm was powerful. Their ambitions were real. Their internal fractures, too, were real, made more dangerous by the kind of influences that thrive when kingdoms begin to believe that ends justify means. In this period, faith becomes a sharper blade than steel. Elven realms were never faithless, but as tensions rose, religion and ideology began to fuse. Some courts leaned on the authority of ancient deities to sanctify their political claims. Others grew more willing to tolerate darker practices, especially when those practices offered advantage. When survival becomes a justification, almost anything can be filed under necessity. Here is the mid-part turning point, the moment that redefines the earlier elegance of the first flowering. The Elven empires began to treat one another not as rival nations, but as corrupted versions of a single people. That shift is catastrophic. It makes negotiation feel like compromise with impurity. It makes restraint look like weakness. It makes conquest feel like cleansing. When that mindset takes root, the First War does not need a grand reason. It only needs an excuse. And excuses were plentiful. A border incident, a disputed woodland, a broken marriage pact, a perceived slight in a hall where every word is weighed like gold. Even the most responsible chroniclers struggle to pin the start to one clean spark, because the truth is more unsettling. The fire began as a slow heat, warming the continent for centuries until at last, someone decided it was time to burn. So when open conflict finally came, it did not feel sudden to the elves who lived through it. It felt inevitable. Arivandar moved to assert dominance, presenting its campaigns as stabilization, an end to dangerous independence, a cure for fragmentation. To those on the receiving end, it looked like annexation wearing ceremonial robes. Courts that had once traded wonders now measured one another by readiness and threat. And in Elven politics, readiness has teeth. High magic, once used to preserve, was increasingly considered for use to punish. Not always in reality, not always in practice, but in imagination first. And imagination, among mages, is where disasters are born. Because when a civilization has the power to reshape a landscape, the line between defense and vengeance becomes thin. It is easier to justify extraordinary measures when you believe your enemy threatens not merely your realm, but the very idea of what the people are. The Crown Wars, in their earliest phase, can be understood as the failure of Elven restraint. Not because elves lacked intelligence, because they trusted intelligence too much. They believed they could control escalation. They believed their sophistication made them immune to the crude spiral that destroys younger nations. That belief was another kind of arrogance, and arrogance among immortals lasts a long time. By the end of this chapter, one thing becomes clear. The rise of the Elven empires was not a straight ascent into greatness. It was a climb that narrowed the path behind them. Every ward that made a realm more permanent also made its pride more rigid. Every refinement that made a court more elegant also made it less willing to admit error. Every claim of being the truest expression of Elven destiny made coexistence feel less acceptable. The first flowering taught the people how to build wonders that could endure for millennia. But it also taught them something darker, how easy it is for beauty, permanence, and certainty to become reasons to rule, rather than reasons to remain wise. War did not arrive in the Elven world like a stranger at the gate. It arrived like a relative, someone the courts believed they understood, someone they thought they could control, someone they assumed would obey the old rules. For a time, they treated conflict as a tool of policy rather than a force of transformation. Borders were tested. Outlying woods changed hands. A few strongholds fell. then were taken back, then renamed as if a new name could cleanse what had happened there. The first campaigns of the Crown Wars still carried traces of restraint, formal declarations, envoys dispatched under ancient protections, the careful language of correction and necessity. In the records, the empires still tried to sound civilized, while doing what civilizations always do when they begin to fear one another. They searched for a moral excuse to injure. But the deeper truth is simpler. Once an elven realm raised the sword against another elven realm, something old broke. Not a treaty, not an alliance. A sense of kinship that had quietly endured beneath rivalry. In Arivandar, the ideology that unity must be achieved under the right crown began to harden into something sharper than ambition. It became faith without a god, an insistence that the people could be perfected through domination. The longer the wars went on, the more Arivandar's ruling houses treated opposition as corruption. That turn mattered more than any single victory, because it made compromise feel like surrender to disease. And when a nation begins to speak of its rivals as a sickness, it stops asking whether the cure will kill the patient. Far to the south, another transformation was taking place, one that later ages would remember with dread so deep it would distort the past into a single, oversimplified condemnation. Elithir, the dark elven realm, did not begin as a myth of evil. It began as a power, ancient, organized, proud, and fully part of the elven world's political gravity. It had its own courts, its own claims to grandeur, its own rivalries with neighbors who feared it and at times relied on it. But within Elithir, the Crown Wars acted like pressure on a fault line. Old ambitions turned impatient, old rivalries turned violent, and practices that would once have been whispered at the edges of society gained legitimacy in the name of advantage. This is where the sources become careful again, because what happened in Elithir is not a single clean event. It is a drift, a gradual movement from ruthless statecraft into something spiritually diseased. As the wars deepened, certain powers rose in influence within Elithir. Cults and priesthoods that promised strength without restraint, victory without mercy, dominion without apology. The Dark Elves began to tolerate, and then embrace, forces that the rest of the Telquesir regarded with ancient suspicion. The names of those powers would later define the catastrophe, but the true turning point is earlier than any name. The moment a realm decides that the only unforgivable sin is losing. Once that decision is made, cruelty becomes policy, and policy becomes identity. The northern empires noticed, not always immediately, not always accurately, but enough to feed a widening fear that Elithir was not merely a rival realm, but a realm becoming something else, something willing to break taboos that had once protected the people from themselves. At the same time, Elithir watched Arivandar's push for dominance and saw a threat of a different kind. Not spiritual corruption, but cultural annihilation, an empire that believed it had the right to define what an elf should be. Two forms of extremity began to mirror one another across the continent. In the middle of this chapter, a grim anchor settles into place, changing the meaning of everything that came before. The Crown Wars stopped being disputes between realms and became a struggle over what elven civilization would allow itself to become. Because once high magic is involved, war is never just war. Elves did not fight only with blades and arrows. They fought with the shape of the land, with the sanctity of groves, with wards meant to endure beyond mortal imagining. A forest could become a fortress. A road could become a trap. A city's very memory could be protected or weaponized. The temptation was always present. If your enemy's strength comes from ancient enchantment, then shattering that enchantment feels like strategy. And strategy, after enough loss, begins to look like justification for anything. Maeritar stands at the heart of this tragedy because it embodied a possibility the warring empires were beginning to reject. It was a realm known for beauty, for distinctive faith, for the idea that elven greatness could be expressed without the appetite to dominate other elves. In a continent tilting toward extremes, Mieritar's existence became intolerable to those who believed the people must be unified under one rigid definition. Here is a quiet but crucial revelation. Empires at war often choose their targets not because the targets are the strongest, but because the targets represent an alternative future. So pressure tightened around Mieritar. Not all at once, not always openly, but steadily, through suspicion, through propaganda, through the slow isolation that makes a realm look guilty simply because it stands alone. The more the wars spread, the more neutral kingdoms found themselves accused of disloyalty by both sides. The moral space between rival crowns shrank until there was hardly room to breathe. Meanwhile, within Elithir, the internal descent accelerated. The war gave cover to those who wanted darkness, because desperation is a mask cruelty can wear without being recognized. The realm's practices grew harsher. Its enemies grew more convinced that the Dark Elves were beyond reconciliation. And the Dark Elves, seeing themselves increasingly condemned as monsters, began to embrace the role with a cold pride. That is one of history's most poisonous patterns. When a people is told long enough that it is damned, some will eventually decide to live as if damnation is their inheritance. By the close of this part, the contours of the coming catastrophes are visible, not as prophecy, but as consequence. Arivandar's imperial certainty has become a machine that needs enemies to justify itself. Elithir's internal corruption has become a furnace that turns ambition into atrocity. Other realms, caught between them, are forced into choices that will stain them for ages. Yet there is one resolved truth that stands over everything like a shadow cast by a high, unsetting sun. The Crown Wars were no longer simply a series of battles. They were a long moral breakdown, an age in which the Elven empires learned that the most dangerous enemy is not an invading army, but the belief that victory is worth the loss of what once made you a people. In Elven memory, the Crown Wars are often spoken of as if they were one long calamity, an unbroken storm. But storms have rhythms. They build, they pause, they shift direction. And in those pauses, whole realms made choices that later generations would call unthinkable. Choices that, in the moment, felt like the only way to survive. By the time the wars entered their most poisonous phase, the continent had already been changed in quieter ways. Travel between elven courts, once routine, became rare and guarded. Ambassadors moved with escorts. Messages were sealed in spells designed to resist interception. The old courtesy of hospitality weakened. A guest could be treated as a threat simply for arriving. Even language hardened. Phrases that once signaled kinship began to sound like irony. The Telquesir were learning an ugly truth about longevity. When you live long enough, you can watch distrust become tradition. Arivandar, under the influence of its most aggressively imperial houses, continued to press outward. What began as ideological dominance became practical annexation, and then something worse, a pattern of enforcing loyalty through humiliation. Tribute was demanded, customs were imposed, local rulers were expected to kneel not as allies, but as proofs of Arivandar's right to command. It is here that the Vishan line's reputation darkens most sharply in the record, not merely for ambition, but for the particular kind of certainty that cannot tolerate disobedience. A court can endure hunger. It can endure military setbacks. It can even endure scandal. What it cannot endure, once it becomes imperial, is the sight of another crown refusing to bow. So the wars widened. More realms were dragged in, not always through conquest, but through fear. An alliance with one power became an automatic insult to another. A refusal to take sides was treated as a hidden side. In this climate, high magic changed character. Earlier in the first flowering, the greatest workings were built as guardians, mythic protections meant to preserve cities, forests, and sacred places. Now those same arts were studied for the darker question they raised. If high magic can shape a sanctuary that endures, what can it do to a sanctuary it wishes to destroy? This is the first great turning point of Part 5. The weave itself becomes a battlefield. Not metaphorically, but literally, as realms begin to consider magical devastation as a legitimate instrument of policy. The change was not immediate. It arrived through rationalization, a ward broken for necessity, a grove burned to deny the enemy cover, a sacred site violated because they would have done it to us. These are the phrases that appear again and again in the moral collapse of civilizations. They are always delivered with the same calm seriousness. They are always lies that people tell themselves so they can keep living with what they have done. Against this rising brutality, some powers tried to impose limits, not because they were saints, but because they understood a deeper danger. Elven magic is vast, but it is not clean. When you tear open the foundations of reality in anger, the consequences can outlast your victory by 10,000 years. Yet restraint was losing its prestige. Among the Telquesir, honor had once been tied to patience and mastery. In the Crown Wars, honor began to be tied to results, and results in war reward the ruthless. Maeritar suffered under this shift more than most. Its position and identity made it vulnerable from the start, close enough to northern powers to be pressured, distinct enough to be mistrusted, and principled enough to be accused of weakness by those who had turned victory into their only virtue. The realm's very existence suggested that a different elven future was possible. And in the logic of extremity, alternative futures become threats. So Mieritar became isolated, not always by siege, often by reputation. Rumors and accusations moved faster than armies. Other realms began to hesitate before offering support, fearing that contact itself could be interpreted as disloyalty. In that hesitation, Mieritar's safety thinned. Here lies a smaller revelation that matters because it is so human, so familiar. Sometimes a kingdom does not fall because its allies turn against it, but because they wait too long to stand beside it. As tensions tightened, the wars grew increasingly entangled with the rising darkness in the south. Elithir's corruption was no longer merely internal. It began to bleed outward, through alliances of convenience, through shared enemies, through the quiet exchange of practices that should have remained taboo. The more the dark elves were condemned, the more some within their realm embraced powers that promised vindication through domination. And that embrace gave other elven realms what they believed they needed: moral certainty. If Elithir could be framed as irredeemably corrupted, then any action against it could be called defense of the people. If Mieritar could be framed as compromised, or simply in the way, then actions against it could be called tragic necessity. The Crown Wars thrived on this transformation of politics into righteousness. In the middle of Part 5, The anchor settles with a weight that cannot be lifted. The wars stop being winnable in any clean sense. Even if a realm gains territory, it loses something more precious: trust, restraint, the ability to see another elf as kin rather than as a problem. At this stage, the record begins to circle one looming name, not as a single event yet, but as a gravity pulling everything toward it. A disaster of magic. The chroniclers do not describe it early. They approach it indirectly, as if careful language could reduce its horror. They speak, instead of escalating magical strikes, of bitter retaliations, of the sense that the great workings of the first flowering were being turned inside out, used not to preserve, but to annihilate. This is the resolved truth at the end of Part 5. The Elven empires had crossed a line. They had taught themselves that the greatest acts of their civilization, high magic, long planning, mastery of the weave, could be bent toward destruction with the same pride that had once built wonders. And once that lesson is learned, it is difficult to unlearn it, because it offers an intoxicating promise that you can end an enemy not by defeating them, but by erasing the ground they stand upon. In that promise, the beauty of the first flowering becomes a weapon, and weapons, once forged, ask to be used. When the catastrophe finally came, it did not feel like a twist in history. It felt like the end of a long, quiet argument the Elven empires had been having with themselves. How far may you go to win? In the later phases of the Crown Wars, that question stopped being philosophical. It became operational. Realms began to prepare for strikes that were not meant to seize a city, but to ruin it. Not meant to humble an enemy, but to make the enemy's existence difficult, perhaps impossible, to continue. This is what happens when high magic becomes normal in war. The scale of acceptable harm expands until it can contain anything. Mieritar stood directly in the path of that expansion. It was not the largest elven realm. It was not the most militarized. But it carried a kind of symbolic weight that made it dangerous to those who had reduced elven destiny to domination. Mieritar's mixed heritage and distinctive culture, its refusal to define elven greatness in the narrow language of a single imperial court, made it an affront to Arivandar's hardening ideology. In that grim arithmetic, destroying Mieritar would do more than remove a rival. It would remove an alternative. So the pressure that had once been political became existential. The record gives different emphases depending on whose quill is speaking. Some accounts frame what followed as a calculated strike, others as a desperate overreach. Some place greater blame on Arivandar's imperial factions. Others spread culpability wider, noting that war rarely allows innocence to remain clean for long. But even when the sources disagree on details, they agree on the shape of the result. A realm was shattered by magic on a scale that left the land permanently altered. The event later ages called the Dark Disaster did not merely defeat Mieritar, it broke it. It is difficult to convey what this means without becoming melodramatic, because the truth is already heavy enough. The place that had once been woodland and lived in beauty became, in large part, a scar. Regions that had supported life became hostile. The memory of the realm did not vanish, but it became fragmented, survivors, ruins, corrupted stretches of land that carried a warning in their very silence. This was not conquest. This was annihilation. And when an elven civilization, so proud of its patience, so careful about its ancient taboos, chooses annihilation, it confesses something about itself that cannot be forgotten. It is willing to destroy the people's future to secure its own victory. The dark disaster changed the crown wars more than any coronation or treaty ever could, because it forced a realization even the most pride-blinded courts could not ignore. If this could be done once, it could be done again. Fear, which had been growing steadily, now became a governing force. Realms began to view one another not simply as threats, but as potential authors of apocalypse. Trust, already bleeding, collapsed further. Alliances grew frantic and brittle. Neutrality became nearly impossible, because to remain unaligned now looked like an invitation to be targeted without consequence. The mid-part anchor of this chapter is simple and devastating. After the dark disaster, the Elven Wars ceased to be about who would rule. They became about who would survive the consequences of Elven power unleashed. Arivandar, rather than achieving security, found itself increasingly isolated by the horror it had helped make possible. Even those who had once tolerated its dominance began to resist the idea that any realm should hold that kind of authority unchallenged. The empire that had imagined itself as the people's rightful guide became, in many eyes, a lesson in what happens when guidance becomes obsession. Within Arivandar itself, the logic of purity and destiny grew more desperate. When an empire commits an atrocity, it must either repent or double down. Repentance would mean admitting it was never fit to command. So factions within Arivandar reached instead for justifications that hardened into fanaticism. That the disaster was necessary, that Mieritar was compromised, that the realm had been a danger to Elven unity, that history would eventually understand. History rarely understands annihilation. It remembers it, and memory among elves is a blade that does not dull. In the south, the shockwaves of the dark disaster did something else. It deepened the divide around Elithir. Those already convinced that the dark elf realm was irredeemably corrupted pointed to the widening horrors of the war as proof that restraint had failed, and that only radical measures could protect the people. At the same time, those within Elithir who had been drawn toward darker powers saw the continent's brutality and decided that morality was merely a weapon used by the strong. If the northern empires could erase a realm, why should the south be judged for seeking any power that would keep it alive? In that spiral, the Crown Wars entered a final phase where punishment and defense became indistinguishable. Other elven realms, horrified and threatened, began to reorganize their politics around a new consensus. Arivandar must be checked. The idea of a unified elven world under Arivandar's crown had once been a seductive theory. Now it looked like a pathway to repeated disasters. The wars, however, could not simply stop. Too much blood had already been spent. Too many grievances had become inherited identity. Courts had built their legitimacy on promises of victory. Retreat would now look like weakness, and weakness in this era was treated as an invitation for annihilation. So the conflict moved toward reckoning, not necessarily in a single climactic battle, but in a continental shift. Alliances that had once been temporary began to solidify into opposition. The elven world's center of gravity moved away from Arivandar's dream of supremacy and toward the grim necessity of preventing another dark disaster. By the end of Part 6, the rise of the elven empires can be seen in its true shape. They had created wonders that could endure beyond mortal imagining. Then they had proved they could ruin those wonders just as completely, and in doing so, they transformed elven history from a story of expansion into a story of caution. Because after Mieritar's shattering, no elven realm could claim innocence in ignorance. They now knew what their civilization was capable of. The only question left was whether they could live with that knowledge without becoming monsters. After the dark disaster, the crown wars did not slow into peace. They hardened into judgment. When a people witnesses an atrocity on that scale, it does not return to ordinary politics. It begins to search for meaning that can contain what happened. It looks for a culprit large enough to carry the weight. It looks for a remedy strong enough to guarantee the horror will not be repeated. Among the Telkasir, this search became a silent reshaping of the entire Elven world. The old question, who should lead, was replaced by a colder one. Who must be stopped? Arivandar, once the luminous symbol of northern imperial confidence, found itself surrounded by a new atmosphere, suspicion that had become almost spiritual. Even realms that had once aligned with it began to treat its ambition as a contagion. The very idea of elven unity under one crown now carried the scent of catastrophe. Unity in this phase began to mean something else: coordination against a threat inside the people. This was Arivandar's unintended creation. It had trained its rivals to think in continental terms. It had made them imagine the elven world as a single system, something that could be protected only by limiting the most dangerous node within it. So the alliances shifted. Resistance grew organized. The wars entered the stage where the greatest battles are not won by bravery, but by endurance, by making an imperial machine exhaust itself, by denying it easy victories, by forcing it to spend more resources to gain less ground. Within Arivandar, the reaction was predictable. The imperial factions did not read opposition as legitimate fear. They read it as envy and disloyalty. They insisted that the other realms were sabotaging the people's destiny out of weakness. And because their ideology was built on purity, their political imagination could not easily accommodate the possibility that they had become wrong. This is where a small but meaningful revelation emerges from the pattern of the war. Arivandar's greatest weakness was not that it lacked power, but that it could not change its story about itself. Empires can survive defeat. They struggle to survive humiliation. As Arivandar's position weakened, it began to lean harder on coercion. Vassals were squeezed. Tribute increased. Neutral realms were pressured into alignment through threats and inducements that no longer bothered to sound polite. The empire's tone changed, and tone matters. Once a realm speaks openly like a master, it becomes harder for anyone to pretend they are an ally. Meanwhile, the south continued to darken. Elithir's internal corruption, long intensified by war, reached the point where it could no longer be dismissed as mere ruthlessness. Darker faith, once a subterranean influence, became a defining force in some factions, and with that came practices and attitudes that alienated the realm further from the rest of Elven civilization. But the tragedy of this phase is that the Elven world's moral clarity did not automatically increase. The more the continent sought a solution, the more it began to think in absolutes. Arivandar was increasingly treated not as a realm that had committed horror, but as a realm that embodied horror. Elithir was increasingly treated not as a realm sliding into corruption, but as corruption itself. In that atmosphere, mercy started to look like complicity. This is the mid-part anchor that reshapes the meaning of the later Crown Wars. The elves moved from war to punishment, and punishment has a different logic than war. War seeks advantage. Punishment seeks finality. Finality, in this context, meant breaking crowns, not merely defeating armies. Arivandar's imperial dominance was eventually checked in ways that forced the realm to confront limits it had refused to recognize. The details of the later campaigns vary across accounts, but the arc is clear. The elven world collectively rejected the idea that Erevandar could speak for all the people. Its hegemony fractured. Its political project failed, not because the people lost capacity for unity, but because they learned to fear what unity under fanatic certainty could produce. Yet even as Arivandar weakened, the southern question grew more urgent. Because while Arivandar's threat was imperial domination, Elathir's threat, at least as perceived by its enemies, was existential corruption. The fear was not merely that the Dark Elves would conquer, but that the Dark Elves would bring a darkness into Elven civilization that could not be contained by ordinary defeat. This fear became the continent's most dangerous justification. If you believe a rival is not merely an enemy but a spiritual infection, then the measures you consider defensive become extreme. And because the Dark Disaster had proven that extreme measures were possible, the taboo against them had been weakened. Elven courts began to consider solutions that were not about borders at all, but about transformation. That is a terrifying word in a world of high magic. The later Crown Wars, as they bend toward their conclusion, begin to feel less like a series of battles and more like a tribunal that no one can appeal. The people, horrified by what they had done to Mieritar, now feared what might happen if war continued unchecked. Yet they also feared what might happen if Elethir's descent continued. So they moved toward a verdict. And the verdict would not be a treaty. It would be a wound carved into the identity of an entire people. By the end of Part 7th, one resolved truth sits heavy in the record. The Elven empires rose by building permanence, but they were now trying to achieve safety through irreversible acts. They had begun the age shaping forests and cities to last forever. Now they were preparing to reshape a people. And once you decide that reshaping a people is acceptable, you are no longer simply defending civilization. You are gambling with the soul of it. There are moments in history when every path forward is stained, and the choice is not between good and evil, but between catastrophe and a different catastrophe. The later Crown Wars placed the Telquasir inside such a moment. By this stage, the Elven world had learned two lessons that should never be learned together. First, that high magic could shatter a realm and scar the land for ages. Second, that war among immortals can continue until it consumes memory itself. Courts began to look at the map and understand a chilling possibility. If nothing changed, there might not be an Elven civilization left worth preserving. This is where judgment becomes policy. Elethir had become the axis of that judgment. The Dark Elf realm was no longer treated as merely a rival nation. In the minds of many other Elven courts, it had become a symbol of an internal threat, proof that the people could fall into something unrecognizable. The faith and practices that had gained power within Elethir, the brutal logic of survival and dominance, the widening gulf between its values and those of other realms, these were read not as a political crisis, but as a moral emergency. And once a crisis is framed as moral emergency, restraint begins to look like betrayal. Some accounts emphasize that the condemnation of Elethir was not unanimous at first, that even then, there were voices warning against collective punishment, voices insisting that condemning an entire people for the crimes of factions would be a kind of madness. Other accounts portray the decision as inevitable the moment Elethir's corruption became undeniable. These are the scholarly variants that linger in the record. Whether the Elven world moved too quickly toward a final solution, or whether it waited far too long. But all versions converge on the same central fact. A decision was made that could not be undone. The people's leaders, backed by powers and authorities beyond any single realm, moved toward a response that was not meant to defeat Elethir on the field. It was meant to remove Ilithir as a danger by transforming it, breaking it, and severing it from the surface world that had birthed it. This is the mid-part anchor, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before. The Elven empires, horrified by the dark disaster, nevertheless chose an act just as irreversible, because they believed it was the only way to end a spiral that had already proven capable of annihilating whole realms. The catastrophe that followed would later be remembered as the descent of the Drow. It is spoken of so often that its scale can become abstract, like a myth repeated until it loses its teeth. But in the context of the Crown Wars, it was not an old legend. It was a verdict delivered into living bodies. The Dark Elves were changed, not merely politically, not merely culturally, but in a way that marked them at the level of identity, driven away from the surface, transformed into a people whose future would unfold in the lightless depths of the Underdark. The punishment was cosmic in its severity, and it carried a cruel clarity. The Elven world had decided that Ilithir, as it had become, could no longer remain what it was. This is where the tragedy becomes unbearable, because the Elven empires were not striking a weapon from an enemy's hand. They were striking the enemy's hand. And when you do that, you cannot pretend afterward that your civilization is clean. The descent did not simply end a threat. It created a new one, more secretive, more bitter, shaped by exile and hatred and the memory of a judgment they experienced as collective damnation. The Drow's later history would be vast, complex, and filled with internal struggle, but the seed planted here was simple. An entire people was made to live beneath the world, and the surface elves told themselves the darkness below was proof that the verdict had been correct. It is easy, in later centuries, to speak of the Drow as if their nature was always fixed. The record of the Crown Wars does not support that comfort. It suggests something more terrifying, that a people can be pushed into a destiny and then condemned for embodying it. Meanwhile, the Elven world above did not find peace in this act, because the descent was not a healing, it was a scarification. It ended one phase of the Crown Wars, but it left behind a moral injury that would ripple across Elven history. Realms that supported the judgment carried the weight of what they had done. Realms that doubted it carried a different weight, the knowledge that they had been unable to prevent it. And among the survivors of Ilithir, now Drow, the memory did not fade into acceptance. It hardened into identity, and identity in exile becomes sharp. After the descent, the Elven empires looked at themselves and saw something unfamiliar. They had begun the first flowering, believing they were shaping permanence. Forests protected, cities preserved, art and magic raised beyond the reach of time. Now they had proven they could shape damnation just as effectively. In the wake of the verdict, the remaining surface realms were forced to reckon with a question that could not be solved by victory. If the people were capable of doing this to their own, what did that say about the people? By the end of Part 8, one resolved truth settles like ash. The Crown Wars were no longer merely a tragedy of politics. They were a tragedy of civilization, discovering that its greatest powers, its longevity, its mastery of magic, its certainty, could produce outcomes so irreversible that even survival would feel like a kind of loss. After the descent, silence entered Elven history in a new way. Not the peaceful silence of forests at dawn, nor the reverent hush of a temple before song. This was the silence that follows a verdict too severe to celebrate. The Crown Wars did not end instantly. They simply lost the illusion that they could be heroic. Too much had happened. Too much had been reshaped. Too many names now carried the weight of things that could not be repaired. In the wake of that transformation, the surviving surface realms faced a reality that no coronation could resolve. They had survived their own greatness. The great imperial dream of Arivandar had already been broken in practice, even if its pride lingered in the stories its remnants told about themselves. The northern crown that once sought to define Elven destiny for all the people had been checked and diminished by resistance, exhaustion, and the continent's growing fear of another magical catastrophe. Arivandar's project, Unity by Supremacy, had failed, not because elves forgot how to build wonders, but because they learned what wonders become when driven by fanatic certainty. Yet there is a quieter truth in the record. Empires rarely die in a single collapse. They dissolve. They shed territory, influence, legitimacy, until the name remains more powerful than the reality. Arivandar's dissolution did not bring relief. It brought fragmentation. Smaller powers and successor states hardened around old lines. Courts that had once feared Arivandar now feared one another, because the stabilizing pressure of a dominant empire, however oppressive, had at least made the shape of the political world predictable. Once that pressure vanished, old rivalries resurfaced with new intensity. The Elven world had removed one threat, only to find that the soil beneath it was still poisoned. This is the first revelation of Part 9. The Crown Wars did not simply destroy realms. They taught the surviving realms to distrust the very idea of permanence. High magic had been used to annihilate and transform. The weave had been treated like a weapon. The scars on the land and the scars in memory made it harder for any court to believe that civilization could be secured through grand works. A sanctuary could become a target. A beautiful city could become a reason someone decides to erase it. Even the greatest wards now carried a bitter question. Will this protect us, or will it paint a mark on our backs? In this climate, Elven culture began to change in subtle but profound ways. Where earlier ages sought expansion, later ages began to prize concealment. Where earlier courts displayed splendor as a form of legitimacy, later courts learned that splendor invites predators. Where earlier kingdoms believed they could shape the future of the surface world, later kingdoms began to consider withdrawal as wisdom. But this change did not happen because elves became timid. It happened because elves became experienced. The mid-part anchor of this chapter is not a battle or a decree. It is a collective realization spreading through surviving realms like cold. If we continue to live as empires, we will eventually repeat the disasters of empire. That realization began to influence everything: how realms chose their alliances, how they treated outsiders, how they remembered their own past. The chroniclers of later centuries would often speak of the Crown Wars as a warning against internal division, but the deeper warning was sharper. Even unity can become monstrous if it is demanded by those who believe their right to lead is beyond question. So the surviving surface elves began to seek stability in a different form. Some realms focused on rebuilding, restoring what could be restored, healing what could be healed, and, where healing was impossible, learning to live around the wound. Others chose distance. Political centers shifted. Great cities became quieter. The old imperial pride did not vanish, but it became more cautious, more guarded, as if the people had learned that confidence without restraint is not strength. It is a fuse. And under everything ran the new reality created by the descent. The Drow were now beneath the world. Their exile did not end Elven conflict. It relocated part of it into a realm of darkness where grievances could ferment unseen. The surface elves carried the psychological consequence of knowing that an entire people, once kin, had been driven away and transformed. Some treated the result as justice. Others carried a quieter discomfort they could not name, because naming it would require questioning the verdict that had been framed as necessary for survival. That discomfort became one of the most enduring legacies of the Crown Wars, the fracture of Elven identity. Because even among surface elves, the people could no longer easily say "we" without remembering who had been cut out of that word. By the end of Part 9, the Elven empires were still present in name and memory, but their age of confident rise was gone. In its place stood a more haunted civilization, still ancient, still capable of breathtaking art and magic, but now tempered by the understanding that their highest achievements could become reasons for ruin. The first flowering had once been a celebration of what the people could build. The Crown Wars transformed it into a warning about what the people could justify. And in the quiet that followed, the surface realms began to turn away from the idea of empire itself, not because they lacked power, but because they finally understood the price of using it without mercy. The only question left was what shape Elven survival would take in the centuries ahead: continued dominance, or a retreat into secrecy, memory, and controlled fading. The wars had not merely ended an age, they had changed the people's relationship with the world. The end of the Crown Wars did not arrive like triumph. It arrived like exhaustion, like the moment a long-lived people finally realizes that the thing it has been fighting to preserve is being destroyed by the fight itself. In later centuries, Elven sages would speak of the wars as a catastrophe of pride and division, but those words are too clean. The truth is heavier. The Elven empires rose high enough to touch permanence, and then discovered that permanence can be broken. By enemies, yes, but even more easily by your own certainty. When the last campaigns faded, what remained of the first flowering was not a single empire, but a continent of remnants. Arivandar's dream of supremacy had collapsed under the weight of its own ideology, not because elves forgot its splendor, but because splendor had become inseparable from fear. The realm that once spoke as if it had inherited the right to define Elven destiny left behind a lesson sharper than any sword. The most dangerous crown is the one that believes it is morally entitled to rule. Mayeritar, shattered by the dark disaster, became the proof that high magic, treated as weapon, can erase more than cities. It can erase futures. The land itself carried the memory of that choice, and even when later ages tried to rebuild around the scar remained. A people can recover from conquest. It does not easily recover from deliberate annihilation. And beneath the world, the drow carried the verdict of the descent like an inherited wound. The surface elves told themselves the exile was necessary, a grim act of protection. The drow remembered it as damnation. Both memories hardened over time, and from those hardened memories, whole civilizations grew, one above, one below, each convinced the other was proof of everything that had gone wrong. This is the first and deepest resolution of the arc. The rise of the Elven empires cannot be separated from the birth of lasting division within Elven identity itself. The people survived, but they did not remain whole. In the centuries that followed, surface elves began to change their strategy for survival. They became less interested in expanding dominion and more interested in preserving what remained unbroken. Where the first flowering had prized visibility, cities that stood as monuments to enduring art and power, the post-war eras began to prize concealment. Hidden sanctuaries, guarded borders, wards that were not meant to impress, but to protect. This shift did not happen because elves became weak. It happened because they became honest about what their strength could do. The mid-part anchor of this final chapter is a simple turning point that echoes through later Elven history. The people began to treat withdrawal as wisdom, not shame. It is in this long shadow that later choices make sense. Why certain realms and cultures would turn inward. Why the idea of a retreat could become not merely a political decision, but a cultural instinct. The memory of the Crown Wars taught the Telquesir that empire invites escalation, and escalation invites irreparable magic. If you want to endure, you must make yourself harder to provoke, harder to envy, harder to target. So Elven civilization endured, but in a different posture. The great imperial courts did not disappear entirely, but they learned to be cautious with their own brilliance. Art remained, magic remained, song remained. Yet even these carried a new undertone: remembrance. A sense that beauty is not just celebration, but preservation. Because beauty is what war tries to erase first. And this is the second resolution. The Crown Wars reshaped Elven culture into something more guarded, more haunted, and, ironically, more mature. The first flowering was full of confidence that time would protect Elven achievements. The Crown Wars proved that time only protects what you refuse to destroy yourself. When later chroniclers open their tomes, they often search for a single villain to carry the weight of the era. A single house, a single realm, a single corrupted faith. But the most responsible records resist that simplicity. They show a pattern that is far more unsettling. Most catastrophes are built collaboratively, through decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. A realm pursues unity for stability. A court pursues power for defense. A mage crosses a line for necessity. A people accepts collective punishment for survival. Each step is small enough to justify. The final result is enormous enough to regret forever. So what truth is fully uncovered at the end of this chronicle? That the Elven empires rose not merely through genius and longevity, but through the belief that their genius entitled them to shape the world and to shape one another. Their greatest glory was also their greatest temptation, the ability to make decisions whose consequences would last longer than memory. And when those decisions were driven by certainty rather than restraint, the people learned that immortality does not prevent tragedy. It only gives tragedy more time to deepen. In the end, the Crown Wars did not end Elven civilization. They ended the innocence of Elven civilization. They proved that the most dangerous thing the Telquesir could face was not an invading race, not a monstrous threat from beyond the stars, not even the darkness below the earth. It was the moment an elf looked at another elf and decided, "You must be changed, or you must be erased." From that moment onward, every hidden grove, every quiet sanctuary, every guarded city built in the centuries after carried an unspoken vow. Not to rise that way again. Not to build an empire so bright, it becomes an excuse to burn the world in order to keep it shining.